They humiliated a black woman at the airport, not knowing the triplets were heirs to a mafia boss. The announcement for Gate 47 peeled through the terminal like cold glass. Suitcases clicked, phones chimed, and somewhere near the coffee kiosk, a child dropped a sticker and began to wail. The air smelled of cheap perfume and recycled travel. Bright light pooled through the high windows and turned the polished floor into a faint mirror. Amara Baptiste stood with 3 small hands in hers. Her coat was a plain navy, her hair pulled back in a careful twist that kept the girls' faces clear. People noticed the 3 identical heads first, a symmetry that made strangers look twice, and then the way each child behaved differently under stress. Mira, tucked close, eyes watchful and reticent. Sage, hands tucked into pockets as though imitating an adult. Zuri, who rocked on the balls of her feet, all cheeks and ears, bright as a bell. She had learned how to move in public with him, how to fold herself small, how to smooth a terrified child's breath, how to say, "We're fine," until other people believed it. Today she carried a single rolling bag and a backpack with a lunch that smelled faintly of cardamom and sugar. A worn paperback leaned against the strap. A tiny dinosaur keychain swung from the zipper. They stopped at the security line when the officer asked to see boarding passes. The approach was routine: paperwork, the scanner, questions about liquids. What should have been mechanical tightened instead, like a glove pulled too hard. The officer's voice softened to a level that somehow held accusation. His questions edged into an examination. Where were the children's passports? Where were their parents? Why were there 3 of them traveling without guardian paperwork? The tone was not curiosity, it was a sentence. Amara produced what she had: passports, a glossy rehearsal schedule from a small company that had hired her as an on-call translator for a cultural event, and a photocopy of a lease. She answered with calm flatness. She explained she was their mother. The paperwork, she said, was in the next bag, but it was all there. She spoke in measured English with a cadence that bore a touch of the Caribbean island that was her first home. Her voice did not rise. That steadiness only seemed to unnerve the officer more. A man in a suit waiting behind them scoffed aloud. 3 kids, 1 woman, and no one's checking, he said, loud enough for the line to turn. Someone lifted a phone. The tip of a camera glinted. A passenger, because a crowd makes its own judgment, fed the small noise into an opinion. They imagined a story that fit easily into their day: negligence, scam, some modern version of lack. The suggestions lodged like splinters, questions whispered, eyes narrowed, a mother's presence reinterpreted as guilt. Amara felt the movement of those gazes as a weather change.
Her palms tightened on the strap. The girls, sensing their mother's tension, huddled. Zuri asked, in her high 5-year-old whisper, "Mama, are we in trouble?" She said it without drama, only trying to catalog the world the way children do. "Sweetheart, we're okay," Amara said, stronger than she felt. She unfolded the extra passport, slid the photocopy into the officer's hand, and explained again that the other forms were simply in the bag that had been checked. The officer glanced at the copies, then back at the woman, then at the identifying mark of her travel stamp. The assumption, once started, takes on a momentum independent of fact. A uniformed voice at a distance called out something procedural about random checks. The officer, now a small man wielding an authority that seemed to intoxicate him, decided the check should be more thorough. He asked for the children's birth certificates. He asked for proof of residency. The words were polite enough, but each request was a demand that pressed against dignity. Video on a phone framed her for strangers: the stoic mother, the children folding into themselves, the security officer, his jaw a line of duty, a bystander's voice narrating a scandal in miniature. People leaned into the scene as if it were a play they'd been invited to. One woman said, "This is not right." And on the other side, a man guessed loudly, "Maybe trafficking, who knows?" The possibility of danger, always the most sensational interpretation, thrummed in the air. Amara's throat tightened in a private, low way. She had learned to be seen as necessary and then invisible, depending on what kept the girl safe. Public humiliation had its own economy. It cost you breath and left you owing calm. She chose to steer the exchange away from spectacle. Her answers were direct. Her eyes avoided the camera angle. "They're mine," she said, and named each child in a slow cadence: Mira, Sage, and Zuri. The names hung there, specific and human and stubborn against a world that wanted to reduce them to numbers. The officer barked something about protocol. A supervisor appeared, Another uniform that made the air denser, and the scene escalated simply because it had escalated, like a fire that finds fuel. Still, Amara stood and held herself. When someone suggested they should call the police, her lips folded into a line and she shook her head. "No," she said. "Please, my girls are scared. Please, just let us go through. We have a flight." Her voice was small but steady. Mira pressed into her hip. Sage clung to a small stuffed animal. Zuri searched the faces of the crowd for an ally. Amara turned to the man who had scoffed and said quietly, "We are trying to leave today. We're not a story for your phone." There was no pleasing or pleading in her tone, only an insistence on basic human decency. The man's smirk faltered for a second under the directness, then returned. Across the terminal, Dante Kwan was watching.
He had come with Victoria, tailored suit, engagement ring catching the light, a preening ease that belonged to an alliance of families and ledgers. They were traveling for a business arrangement that had the careful construction of a public relationship. Two families merging interest, future chapters negotiated with champagne and contracts. Victoria laughed at something someone said and leaned into him as they waited at their gate. Dante allowed it. He was practiced in public gestures and private withdrawals. He had learned how to own an image. The three girls were at the periphery of his vision, initially like a photograph he might glance at and put away. Then he saw the shape of their faces and the curve of their chins, a pattern of line and slope he had memorized and then chosen to forget. For a beat, the terminal thinned to a simple set of features, the arch of an eyebrow he had loved, a slant of cheek that fit in his hand. He had not seen those faces since a night he tried to outrun a life he hadn't agreed to keep. Recognition came like a collision. The world, Victoria's perfume, the office-ready laughter of those around them, the terminal's tinny speaker, fell away into static. He had told himself his past was a closed door. If he was honest, he had walled the memory so well he could walk past it without feeling the seam. Now the seam opened. Dante's first impulse was the old reflex: close distance, intervene, use authority. He imagined stepping over the few rows of seats and catching the officer by the collar and speaking in a tone that stopped people's breaths. But he was tethered to another life in the terminal, expectations, cameras, Victoria's hand already finding his sleeve. Everything that made him a figure of power in the private rooms of his organization would make his involvement complicated here, public, headline-making, useful to enemies. Instead, he did the smallest rude thing a man in his position could do. He left. He left the gate, excused himself with a practiced smile, and retreated into the bustle. He moved so deliberately that it felt like walking underwater. The noise dimmed, and all he could hear was the quick animal click of his heart. He found a quiet corridor, leaned against cool glass, and pressed his palm to the stone like a man touching a past wound to check if it still bled. The humiliation on the other end of the terminal stayed with him. He watched the live feed of the confrontation for a long minute in his head, how a security officer's authority had become a weapon, how the crowd's appetite for spectacle had made a mother vulnerable in public. There was anger in it, raw and familiar, but under that anger was something ruder, older, the recognition of his blood, the evidence of a life he had built without them. He did not return to Victoria right away. He called someone who knew how to move in shadows without leaving footprints. Marco Lee. Marco answered in 4 rings.
His voice had the economy of someone who priced time like a commodity. He was a private investigator who had learned discretion as a trade. "Did something happen?" Marco asked, not politely, but with the thin wire of readiness. Dante's fingers tightened on the phone. He did not say, "I saw them." He said less, because he knew the economy of words better than anyone. "Find a woman," he said. "Black, early 30s, 3 girls, 5 years. Mapo area, translator, quiet, no social." Marco's tone tightened when the name rose unspoken. He knew the unspoken possibility in Dante's voice, the old affair, the ghost children. He did not ask about the details. He did not need to. Marco said, "Give me 4 hours." 4 hours is the kind of promise men like Marco keep because the alternative is to be useless. He hung up and began to move. He used the network Dante had built like a map, a friend at the airport who could harvest footage, a courier who could trace a ticket purchase, a former cleaner who'd worked in a building near the river and remembered faces. No one asked questions about motives. They worked with the currency of efficiency and the quiet assumption that their client paid well enough. Dante stood against the window and watched the city continue as if nothing had shifted. Taxis threaded the streets, lights popped on in office towers, and the smog softened the distant silhouette of the river. He let his mind slide back 6 years. They had argued in a room no larger than a closet, the argument lit by a single lamp and the weight of choices. At 26, he had been younger, certain of the narrow corridor that led to power. Allegiance first, family second. The organization required sacrifice, absolute obedience, and clean exits. He had believed himself capable of compartmentalizing love. He had not understood how protective feeling could rupture the clean lines of a life built on control. Amara had made a different wager. She had given him what he could not keep, parenthood with small human hearts attached, and then walked away engineered toward survival. She left notes and a number, packed up belongings, and took the one thing he had not been able to guard, the children. He had watched from distance. He had chosen his role in the world over the ragged, messy intimacy of fatherhood. That choice arrived at the terminal like a bill he hadn't realized what compound interest. For 6 years he had buried the memory under transactions, threats neutralized before they turned into bodies, and alliances negotiated with grudges like currency. Marco came back in less than the promised 4 hours, because Marco was a man who understood that the faster a problem was named, the more options a man had. He arrived at Dante's hotel room with a slim folder and a slow grin that meant success without moral commentary. "I made a mess," Marco said, handing over a page with a photo taped to it.
The picture was grainy, taken by a camera phone, but the faces were clear. A woman with 3 small girls seated on a bench, each girl's head tipped in the same direction. Dante studied it like a man reading a cipher. The line of the jaw, the fold above the lip. The resemblance was there, quiet and stubborn. Marco had the basics: a name, an address on a narrow street that opened onto the Han River, a list of small gigs where Amara translated for community events, and a payment history that suggested a single steady client. He had an image from a social media event months earlier that placed her at a cultural talk in Mapo. "She keeps to herself," Marco said. "No family around, no—" He paused where 100 possibilities went unsaid. "No public ties." Dante asked fewer questions than Marco offered. He skimmed the dossier and stopped at a detail: a list of the girls' names scribbled by someone in a margin: Mira, Sage, Zuri, in a pen stroke that made the names almost private. Marco said quietly, "If you've been wondering if they're yours, I wouldn't call it speculation." Dante needed nothing else. The paper fell from his hand like a dropped token. He felt both shock and an unsurprising rightness. His breath evened out. A plan, small and dangerous in the same moment, began to assemble in his chest. "You keep this clean," Dante told Marco. "No tales, no leaks. No one finds out I'm looking." Marco smiled, thinned to a line. "When you say clean, you mean the usual. People who ask fewer questions don't get answers. Are you prepared for that?" Dante imagined the engine of his old life. Men in suits, men with heavy hands, people who made problems disappear. He imagined them as an available arsenal, and then imagined presenting them in the park with a toddler on his knee. The image felt obscene and somehow right at once. He said, "I don't want them involved. I want to know they're safe," discreetly. Marco nodded. "I'll find an apartment, watch patterns. If she meets someone, I tell you. If she moves, I follow. If anyone asks, they hear nothing." Dante left Marco with a corner of the city map and a card with his private number. He stood at the window again and watched the Han River thread through the lights like a ribbon of ink. The river had seen more than most people in this city. Couples leaned on its railings, dogs yelped at ducks, and teenagers shared cigarettes and small conspiracies. It was a place where people met, argued, and sometimes reconciled. He told himself he would meet her there. He did not tell Victoria. He did not tell anyone who would complicate the clean edges of a clandestine return. He went back to the gate where she waited, smoothed his tie, and greeted the chatter with a smile that had been rehearsed, as if his other life were several rooms away. Victoria asked if he had seen something on the monitors. He made a joke about a delayed flight and took her hand.
He had become the kind of man who kept his private leaves private, who practiced small denials so large truths would not force an entrance. That night in his hotel, he did not sleep. He sat with a glass of whiskey and the dossier unopened on the table, lights from the street painting his hand in restless strokes. He thought of fatherhood, but not as an abstraction. The girls became real, the way Mira pressed against Amara's hip, Sage's hands in pockets, Zuri's bright insistence. He imagined them with the useless glamour he had once possessed, and he imagined them absented, small, vulnerable, and alive. There was also a ledger of consequences in his mind. If he approached too loudly the people who watched his old life, they would note it. The organization had habits and memory. The name Quan carried weight. He could either bring those habits toward the girls, or he could find a way to shield them from that gravity. He knew which choice would be harder: bury the organization further, or let it churn closer for the sake of the children. He went to the window and watched the river again, tolerating the ache he had spent years learning how to ignore. 2 weeks, he heard himself say aloud, before he realized he had formed the plan into words. 2 weeks of presence. 2 weeks to show her what I can be, without bringing my other life. It sounded small and finite, an offer he both doubted and hoped might be enough. The next morning, Marco delivered a clean outline. The building where Amara left, a modest block that leaned into a narrow lane, an apartment on the second floor with a bald curtain and a laundry line where small socks flapped like white flags. Neighbors described Amara without heroics, the woman who walked near the river at dawn, who sometimes shared pastries with an elderly neighbor, who greeted children with a smile that did not invite curiosity. Her life was a deliberate economy of small, protective choices. Marco's report included photos taken from a distance: a child's colored backpack slung over a shoulder, a corridor light, a pair of shoes left by a door. He had audio clippings where a neighbor mentioned Amara's translation work for a small cultural outreach program, and how she had saved money slowly for the girls. Marco had calls with a landlord who seemed, by the tenor of his voice, either indifferent or protective in a small way. No one had a story pointing to family drama or entanglements. It all painted the portrait of someone who had made a life on disciplined margins. Dante read everything as if translating code. He saw a life of careful decisions, limited public exposure, a pattern of morning walks near the river, a resistance to invitations that would make them visible. Amara's life was a collage of small protections, every choice a kind of armor. He also felt the prick of something sharper: betrayal, anger, and less tidy, a hollow concern that had nothing to do with the ledger he kept for a living.
He had built an empire by erecting boundaries and insisting the world conform to them. These girls were a boundary he had never authorized, a responsibility that suggested he had been circumvented by his own flesh. He did not send money. He debated it, found himself practically drafting a check, imagining it would smooth an exchange, buy gratitude, erase the past. He did not do it. The first step would not be cash. It would be him. He chose to test a different currency: constancy. "Meet me at the Han River," he told Marco. "Wait in the distance. Watch. Don't let her know I'm there. Tell me if she goes." It was small to say it, but in his mouth it tasted like sacrifice. Marco looked at him for a long time. "What are you planning to do if she refuses to see you?" Dante's answer was the honest one. "If she refuses, I will wait," he said. "And I will be there again tomorrow. For 2 weeks. No organization, no threats. I will prove I'm present." Marco's lips drew into a thin line that approximated skepticism. 2 weeks isn't proof to everyone. Dante let him keep that. It was not a guarantee. It was a promise he offered to himself first. The rules in his head were small. No guns. No cars with tinted glass. No emissaries. He would show up as a man who might be only capable of gentlemanly gestures, and a tenacity that did not flirt with violence. He did not expect her to fall into his arms. He expected her to test him, and likely strike him down with truth. He prepared himself for that. Amara did not know any of this. Her life the morning after the airport had moved in a smaller orbit. A market with a woman who sold juice. A subway ride. Bread purchased for the girls' lunches. She taught the girls to line up their shoes by the door, and to fold their napkins with a care that made the small ritual feel important. She measured out the world in practicalities, keeping any potential threat distant with the steady application of routine. Her mind cataloged what belonged to their survival: how to answer strangers, what to say to avoid attention, how to make a hospital seem like a friendly place. She remained haunted by the smallness of the humiliation. It lodged not as trauma but as a practical wound. The way strangers chose to believe stories that fit the simplest prejudice. The way the world cultivated spectacle at the expense of human dignity. She had known inequality in spare measures. Reminders that when a black woman with 3 children stands at a public place, there will always be someone waiting with a ready story. She could not let them make her children into twigs and then burn them for sport.
In the days that followed, she rebuilt the sequence of events like a woman writing a ledger. The officer had asked for a birth certificate. She had explained. When someone suggested the police, she had said no out of the practical fear of paperwork spiraling into a bureaucratic chain reaction that would keep them from their flight.
She made the decision then and there to keep the girls safe by minimizing exposure. Her decision had cost her dignity in a public forum, but it had preserved the girls' sense of safety in that moment. That was an old math she had learned the hard way. Small hurts against public view might be better than big problems that followed. At home, she unpacked their bags and told them stories that smelled like salt and mango. She called an aunt on the phone for advice she rarely sought. She paid the children's school fees with careful counting. The girls asked questions in a way that was brave and ordinary. "Do they think we stole something, Mama?" Zori asked while tracing a crack in the tile. "Some people see only what they expect to see," Amara said. "They have stories ready to fill in the blanks. We don't have to join any of those stories." She taught them to answer simply and to keep their temperature low in public. "We say the truth," she instructed, "but we say it in a way that can't be argued with. We are honest. We are not a problem. If anyone makes a scene, we step away. We protect each other first." Her rules were both love and armor. They were not dramatic. They were survival. What she did not know was that a man in a tower a few miles away had decided to trade a week of power for a demonstration of presence. The idea of Dante showing up at the river, empty-handed and unverifiable, would have seemed absurd to his underbosses. They measured loyalty by transactions and force. But to him, the smallness of a daily walk on the river might be the most violent thing he could do. Violence against the idea that he was irredeemably a tool of empire. For the moment, this remained a private calculus. Marco watched Amara from across the river for 3 mornings before Dante moved. He described to Dante the pattern without commentary. A woman with a sling bag, 3 identical heads, a habit of pausing at the iron rail to look out at the water. He watched the girls play with a paper boat and learned which child bore the responsibility of keeping the other 2 in line. On the 4th day, Dante made the walk. He wore something deliberately modest, jeans, a plain jacket. He left his phone behind for most of the walk so that his presence could be judged only by the way he carried himself. He was a man who had habitually hidden behind power, and now his bare presence felt like the rawest form of vulnerability. He found a bench downstream from where she usually sat. He sat at the edge of his own courage, fingers pressed into denim, and watched the way her hair caught the river light. Amara did not immediately look up. She was a study in quiet, crouched beside the 3 children as if protecting a flame. He rehearsed words in his head. Apologies, pleas, claims of law and name. None of them seemed accurate. He thought of asking what had been through and what had been loss, but language had always been a trap for him. Precise in ledger books, clumsy in affection.
Instead, he waited. Waiting became the instrument he had chosen, slow, patient, and wholly public. He let an hour pass like a debt unpaid. He watched when the girls ran, the way Mira's mouth turned stern as she led the others. He saw Sage look back, assessing him in a way a child measures a stranger's danger. He watched all of it as if studying a map he had never learned to read. When he finally stood and crossed the distance, she saw him at last. Her eyes fixed on him with a slow, precise calculation that had no surprise in it. She recognized him, not as every man with his face, but as a particular set of lines she had once loved and then folded away like a risky memory. The moment she looked at him, the river seemed to hush. Water hitting stone, a child calling to another, tiny intrusions into the hush. Her posture shifted like an animal deciding whether to flee. He said the first thing that felt like an offer rather than a claim. "I saw what happened at the airport," he said simply. Her face did not break. There was no softening. Protectiveness moved across her shoulders like a cloak. "You?" she said, less a question and more a life assessment. "Why do you care?" He could have answered with the truth. "Because they are mine, because I left, because I am trying to buy back what I sold." None of those claims would have landed cleanly. Instead, he asked, "Can we talk? Alone?" She considered the 3 small faces that clustered close to her and said no at first. It was a boundary, not a refusal of conversation, but a refusal of exposure for the children. He accepted it.
He had brought nothing to threaten them with. He would not offer them a theater of explanation at the expense of their safety. They arranged finally to meet without the children. A bench by the Han River at dawn, a neutral space. She set rules without theatricality. No weapons, no organization involvement, no emissaries. Walk away if she asked. He agreed in simple words because he had made the first clumsy bargain to keep the girls out of his dirty world. As they spoke, Amara careful, precise, Dante closer to confession than he had been in years, each kept a measure. He apologized in a particular tone that was not theatrical. He did not promise absolution. He offered presence and then tried to give structure to that presence. 2 weeks of daily attendance at the river, mornings only, no involvement beyond showing up and being reliable. She listened with measured reserve. The humiliation at the airport had not been a singular wound. It had been evidence of a pattern she had never wanted to expose the children to again. She asked practical questions, obviously chosen power over people. If you show up, she said, what will you do when your men call? Will you answer them and leave us to whatever happens?
He laid down specifics, like a man learning how to be a father without teaching a lesson. No calls during their meetings, no cars in the lanes, no men who had anything to do with the things he had once run. Amara chose to test him not with ceremony, but with terms, and he accepted each with the slow gravity of someone who understood that words mean little without repetition. The agreement was unnatural in its simplicity and heavy with future consequence. To Dante, it felt like walking on glass. To Amara, it was stewardship, what she could live with and what she would not. When they left that morning, the river took their conversation and made it small. The world returned. Joggers, an elderly man with a saxophone, a flock of pigeons deciding the rules of a patch of sun. They parted with the sense of a plan not yet complete. Dante kept the appointment the next morning and the next, and slowly, in the rhythm of repeated presence, he began the quiet work that might be called repentance by some and stubbornness by others. But back at the apartment, in the days they did not meet, Amara stitched the walls of their small life back together. She picked up the pieces of normal, smoothie recipes, matching socks, a bedtime story read in 3 voices. She kept her own small ledger of what was allowed, what she would accept for the safety of the girls, and what she would not. Dante kept to the river. His absence from his usual meetings began to show in thin ways, an unanswered call from an underboss, a postponed dinner appearance. He made choices that had cost in the currency his world understood, but he made them in the quiet that had nothing to do with spectacle. He did not announce a change. He allowed the habit of showing up to be his argument. On the 8th day, a man from his organization, a lieutenant used to the economy of orders, left a terse message that smelled of impatience and threat. He heard the note in the sound of a voice he had once mimicked for command. He put the phone away, left it unanswered. Later, he would be forced to face what such an omission meant, but at the river, the only measure that mattered was the small hand that slid into his as a girl passed with a kite. It wasn't a negotiation moment or a reprieve. It was the burgundy of truth. By the 12th day, there were small proofs of change. A pastry left at their bench for Amara, a jacket draped over a child when rain teased the sky, a choice made to be present instead of portable. People started to notice, not watchers but the kind of folk who knew what courage looked like in the quiet parts of a day. An old woman who fed pigeons nodded once when Dante walked past with a pair of small shoes in his hands. "He keeps coming," she said to no one in particular. "That's something." On the morning of the 13th day, a small private victory came that had nothing to do with power. Dante learned Mira's favorite way to fold a napkin, and Zuri taught him how to braid a simple plait.
These were basics of intimacy, small, ineffable stitches with no ledger entry and no applause. He learned how Sage liked his coffee, black and not sweet, and mispronounced the name until a little hand corrected him with the charity of a child. It was the kind of intimacy he could not calculate in reports. Then, on day 14, Amara said yes. She had monitored him in her own way through the days, looking for the pattern of constancy and for the absence of the violent stamps of his old life. She had measured the absence of men with short cigars, the lack of glossed vehicles, the way his face changed when a phone buzzed. There had been times she thought him too soft a thing to be trusted with their safety. There had been times she thought him a hazard. Yet here they were, and the decision to accept a meeting with their children was hers and hers alone. She brought them to the river in a quiet procession, 3 small hands, slight backpacks, a baby blue umbrella in case of rain. Mira's eyes were steady.
Sage's shoulders a tiny fortress, and Zuri's laugh like a small bell. Dante watched from across the grass and felt the air press itself into his lungs. He had rehearsed this moment, and rehearsals always flattened risk into actors hitting marks. This was not rehearsal. This was real, and the girls were alive and unbroken. When he stepped forward, Mira did not run. She studied him as if measuring a stranger's danger. Zuri eventually went to him, and the child's small arms found their way to his waist as if seeking a place. The sensation of a child leaning in, so simple, so mortal, changed the angle of his world. Amara stayed back, stood like a sentinel with her hand on her bagstrap. She watched the three of them with the hard tenderness of a woman who knows what could be taken. Their greeting was small. Dante crouched down to be the right height and said their names, and they repeated them with the dry curiosity of children learning the shapes of grown men. The moment stretched thin and beautiful until a vibration in Dante's pocket thudded against his thigh. He had tried to leave his phone elsewhere for these mornings, but that morning an alert had found him. He glanced at it without thinking, and the screen bloomed into a single word and an image that made his blood slide cold. The photograph showed a close-up of the three girls, Mira, Sage, Zuri, taken from behind. The background in the photo was unmistakable, the exact iron railing along the Han River where they stood. Someone had infiltrated the small privacy they guarded. Below the image, a single line of text bloomed, merciless in its flatness. Found. Dante's hand clenched around the phone like a man who had been given a verdict. The river's gentle noise became an irrelevant soundtrack. The air itself seemed to sharpen into a blade. For a sliver of a second he imagined the scene as a chessboard. Pieces moved against pieces.
He felt the old life, an organization one could not simply remove, arrange itself around the new and fragile thing he held in his arms. Amara watched his face change. She did not directly see the message at first. She saw only the shift in his shoulders, the tightening of the jaw that had once been so practiced in delivering orders. Her eyes moved to the phone in his hand and read the screen with quiet clarity. The small private victory that had been forming across 2 weeks frayed at the edges with a single word. The bench where they had convened became for an instant the stage of possibility, a father's first fragile entry into parenthood, intercepted by a signal that the world he had tried to keep out was not finished with him. Dante folded himself around the girls as one protects a small meal from rain, and the message sat like a stone at the center of the new geometry. "Found," said the phone, and the river kept flowing as if it could wash away the meaning of the word. The word on the screen pulsed like a verdict. Found. It seemed too small to carry the weight it did. 3 syllables, flat type on a backlit rectangle. But in the hush that followed, it struck the bench like hail. Dante felt the river tilt under him. The girls' laughter in that instant sounded distant, a soundtrack from another life. Amara's hand tightened on her bag strap. Her eyes flicked to Dante, and in that movement all the assumptions she had been cautious enough not to make before crowded the space between them. For a few seconds they were not father and mother, not protector and charge. They were 2 adults mid-transaction, deciding what to trade for safety. Mira watched with the small, solemn attention of a child who knows adults keep complicated things from them. Sage folded his arms without quite meaning to. Zuri swung her legs, oblivious for the moment, then looked up as if to say, "We're okay." If this is the kind of story you sit up for, a quiet favor, subscribe for more chapters like this. It helps the channel keep telling these long, slow reckonings. Dante folded the phone back into his hand, and against the smooth river noise, his mind sharpened into a list. Not a plan of attack, at least not yet, but a ledger of immediate truths. The photo meant someone knew their routine. The sender had been close enough, or watched closely enough, to take a picture from an angle that matched where they stood. Whoever had sent it had crossed a boundary he'd promised the girls he would keep them away from. He looked at Amara. The movement of air around her was like a drawn breath. She did not flinch, but her posture adjusted the way a body shields a child. "Who?" Dante began, then stopped. The question was useless until he could offer something besides dread. She met his eyes squarely, the river light lending her face a cool clarity. "Whoever this is," she said, voice quiet and purposeful. "They know where we sit. They know how we move. That means we can't just keep living the same pattern. We leave in 20 minutes. He blinked. The words were not a request. They were a command. Dante had no right to resist. The old reflex that could have turned a statement like that into a negotiation died with a quiet, private shudder in his chest. He had come here promising presence. Promise meant answering, not ordering. "Okay," he said simply. "We go now." It might have been easier to dissolve the instruction into action,
wrap the girls in coats and disappear into a hotel corridor? If Amara's trust were currency he could spend with a glance. It wasn't. She had set terms from the first morning on the river, and she did not abandon them without proof. Proof, in her mind, had never been about dominance. It was about a sequence of choices a man had to make again and again, until a pattern took shape. "Where to?" he asked. She had the address of an aunt in the countryside, a woman who answered her phone by the third ring, and whose apartment smelled of stockpots and rhythm. It was 20 minutes by car, where wind could be thicker and people fewer. Amara had not wanted to mobilize, not yet. Public movement invites attention, but the photograph had already broken the margin of safety. She spoke the name of the aunt in a low voice, and it felt like handing him a map with a single instruction: don't redraw it. "Walk with us to the car," she said. "No cars trailing, no one following. We leave, we go directly." Dante's eyes slid to Marco, who had taken a position near a cluster of trees, pretending to tie a shoe. Marco had been watching them for hours, professional, implacable, but the slight tightness at his mouth betrayed concern. He gave a single tilt of his chin, the private sign that meant he saw what the message implied and that he had already begun to move. They rose together like a small migration. Dante kept his voice low as he addressed the children with a gentleness that, for him, required more force than any command once had. "Let's go get something to eat," he said, and Zuri's face lit at the idea of bread. Outside the false-lit hush of the riverside, the city was a moving organism again. Taxis hummed, a couple argued about a bus schedule. Amara walked at a steady pace, and Dante kept himself deliberately visible and not ostentatious. He offered his jacket when the wind licked colder air at the bridge, and watched as Mira tucked it narrowly across her shoulders, the motion like a small treaty. At the car, Marco arranged an unremarkable driver, an older man who looked like he sold vegetables by day and did not ask about passengers. Marco's competence extended into the art of invisibility. She had people who could shuttle them without creating a spectacle.
That part of the solution sat uneasily against Amara's insistence that soldiers not enter their life. She had said no organization men, and Marco, though not a soldier in Dante's old sense, existed in an in-between, someone whose work touched the edges where safety and secrecy met. "Keep to the side streets," Marco murmured to the driver. "Avoid the highway cameras. We don't want any pattern." He had slipped into the very language of the world Amara wanted to keep away from, and noticing the small lie, the implication of his instruction, she fixed her eyes on him. "Not a tail," she said. "Not your men. Someone to close the door if needed, but no uniformed, no faces that mean violence." Marco looked at her as if considering why she still trusted him at all. "No men with guns," he agreed. "No publicity. Discreet." The driver started the car, and the city slid by in a strip of windows and neon. Dante sat between the smaller seats, the hush of the car wrapping them. He reached out, and, moving in the slow awkwardness of a man trying to build a new muscle, took Zuri's hand. The child folded into the palm, as if into an animal's warmth, and Dante felt something like a bell knell, delicate, sweet, and irrevocable. During the trip, Marco's phone vibrated. He glanced at it, and after a microsecond put it away. He was collecting threads. He didn't gather them into truth for anyone until he could make them hold. Marco's method was not to alarm before formality. He would act, then show what had been done. The aunt's apartment smelled of garlic and slow-simmered stock, and the front room smelled like towels and lemon. The girls made themselves at home in the only way children do, small explorations under a careful eye, a cup rearranged here, a stack of picture books shuffled there. They scampered to the windows and peered out with the interest of children who had not yet been taught to look for threat in every tree. Amara insisted on the rules even then. "Phones on the table when we eat," she said. "No calls unless it's me. Everyone eat. Sleep early. We move tomorrow at dawn." Dante listened and then asked, "Can I help with anything?" She looked at him the way a woman checks whether an offered hand will be steady or a theater prop. "Make the tea," she said finally, "and sit down. Let us know if—" She stopped, then finished, "if you will actually be here when I come back." It was not an invitation to ownership. It was a challenge and a test wrapped inside the smallest possible duty. Dante made the tea in the slow, meticulous way of someone learning to be normal. Water heated just under a boil, a tea bag steeped 2 minutes, a spoon stirred not to show off but to be useful. He placed the cup in front of Zuri and watched the child's brows knit as she took a first sip. The moment was small and human and broke him open in ways money never had. In the apartment, Dante's old life could not find its way in. The furniture was modest. The curtains were tied with string. There were marks of a life loved by someone who could not depend on time. Stickers on the fridge, a child's crayon map of a park, a stray ballet shoe by the door. These were not assets, they were anchors. Marco had slipped outside to make calls. He had a network, and networks spoke cautiously in shadows. He checked corners of the city Dante had not walked for years. He found a small, ugly truth that his client did not want. The photograph had not been taken by an intimate alone. The metadata wasn't the sort of thing Marco would parade before an anxious father. Instead, he had a name of a place and a memory fragment. Someone had been watching their route for weeks, mapping their habits. It was the kind of slow surveillance that meant the sender could wait until the day luck and pattern and proximity converged into an open shot. In the bedroom, the girls slept like small, complete things. Dante sat on a chair and let the rhythm of their breathing recite a new kind of ledger he could not balance with money, power, or fear. He had thought for 6 years that he could remake the choices he'd made by buying silence or arranging a life where his name did not have to carry consequence. Now the consequence was here. It had found them. Amara waited to speak until the apartment was still. "You can't keep them in a fortress," she said then, voice a hushed file. "That is not life. A fortress is also a cage. I raised them to know other people's faces, not to be afraid of them." Dante let the admission sit. "I don't want to build a life with my hands tied to what's easy," he said. "I know the world I belong to makes promises I don't want to deliver to them." Her laugh was without humor. "You left when it mattered," she said. "You walked away from this before it was a choice. That is what you have to repair, not by power but by staying." "There will be pressure," he said, the word containing a dozen things he could not list aloud. "People will not like that I don't use what I have. They will count on me. They will test me." She did not ask him to promise victory. She asked him to promise choice. "Make the choice without telling me it's part of some long game. If you are with us, you're with us. No excuses." He nodded. The choice would cost him more than any gala or alliance could calculate. Later, the ledger would fill with lost dinners, missed deals, enemies given reason. For tonight, it meant facing Victoria, and whatever machinery had been prepared as a hedge against his absence. He imagined what it would look like to tell the Chen family, and those aligned to them, that he had stepped back. It would be like slitting a seam they had stitched around his life. At dawn, Dante moved with purpose. He had not slept, but there was clarity in the rawness of exhaustion. He walked to a small cafe across the street and used the hour to rehearse the mechanics of renunciation that would not need to be shouted. It had to be public enough to be believable, private enough to avoid grandstanding. He called Victoria. He did not do the dramatic theatrics of breaking an engagement at a gala. He had learned the art of subtlety. A text to her aide, a curt note that his schedule had changed, a private interruption he intended to make audible in the right channels. She deserved the dignity of directness, at least before the world rewrote their story without consent. Victoria received him in a glassed suite that reeked of good taste and harder alliances. She was not surprised to see him. She handed him a cup of coffee like a woman offering currency. Her smile did not reach her eyes. "You look tired," she said. "Are you following some philanthropic schedule now?" He did not go into explanations. He gave her a look that had been honed in rooms where fortunes were judged on small inflections. "I need to be somewhere else," he said. "I won't be attending the engagement scheduled this month. I won't be present for the merger dinners. I'm stepping back." Her smile sharpened. "Stepping back is a word for a man in your position to use only carefully. Are you aware what walking away now will do? People will infer weakness. The Chen family will take advantage." He met her with a steadiness she did not like. "If the choice is between another contract and my children, I choose them," he said. There was a silence that was almost a recoil, an admission that reframed reputation as a lesser currency than flesh. Victoria's eyes cleared, turned glacial. "This is about Amara," she said, "about what you had. I understand bargaining, but you should know, the Chen family didn't enter into this to lose face. Then they will have to adjust their expectations," he said. He turned and left without another word. On the elevator ride down, his phone vibrated, a terse message from a lieutenant, an excerpt of a conversation overheard about opportunity costs. He slid the phone into a pocket and did not return the message. For Dante, that refusal was a wound. For him, it was a line drawn. Back in the apartment, life tried to assert a kind of normalcy. Mira braided our hair with a concentration Dante envied. Sage opened a book and found a picture of a boy who looked a little like Dante, hair dark, eyes intent, and held it up for him to read. Dante stumbled through the story, making voices that made the girls laugh.
He burned the toast twice and was corrected by Zuri with an authority that made him smile wide enough to surprise himself. Amara watched. She measured the value of actions rather than rhetoric. When Dante wrapped a small blanket tighter around Zuri without asking, she did not scold. She noted the simple mechanics of what he did and cataloged them as evidence. Marco returned from town with a thin file.
The photograph was taken from a street cam, he said bluntly, and also from a private phone. 2 sources. One is a camera that lives on the building across from the river. You've seen it. The other is a personal device. He paused, formulating the rest in the way that made both information and discretion hold together. The quality's different. The personal device was used to get closer shots some nights ago. We don't know who, but whoever could get a close frame had access and patience. Is it internal? Dante asked. I'm not saying the organization did it, Marco said. I'm saying whoever did this could be anywhere logically connected to you, people who know your routines. That could include rivals, family, or someone else. It could also be someone who assumes being seen will get a reaction. Amara's mouth tightened. Someone wanted you to panic, she said, or to bring the things you hide into public. You didn't believe we should lure them into using force, Marco said to Dante. You were right to want presence without spectacle. But we have to be clear. This was meant to unsettle. Whoever sent the photo didn't care if they scared a woman and her children. They wanted reaction. Dante's fingers closed over the cup of coffee as if squeezing truth from it. We won't make the reaction they want, he said. We'll change patterns. We will move. We will not live on the riverbank anymore. Amara listened and then agreed to something small, a temporary plan to move the girls to a friend's apartment for a week, with Marco maintaining discreet watch, but under the single unambiguous condition that any aid Dante provided be routed through her, and that no one associated with his organization be visible. He accepted the demand with the gravity of a debtor paying the first installment of a long debt. The move was quiet. The children treated it as an adventure and packed stuffed animals into backpacks. Mira tucked small notes into the girls' pockets, a habit she had picked up from Amara, little talismans against the day. At the friend's apartment, an old classmate of Amara's who lived central and had a life not easily infiltrated, the girls settled like wildflowers into a new patch of sun. The arrangement felt precarious, but it also felt like a sentence written in hope. Temporary shelter, however modest, was better than sitting in a river bench waiting for fate. In the small days that followed, Dante lived in a state of double vigilance. He resumed his public role with deliberate absences. He canceled engagements on the grounds of health or minor travel, but his exits were watched and his silence noticed. Whispers followed him. The man who loved and abandoned, the man who had returned with a different currency. Some saw courage, others saw vulnerability. He accepted both labels with a quiet he had not known was available to him. He kept going to the river, even when the girls were safe elsewhere, an ironclad ritual to prove constancy.
Each morning he sat on the same bench where they had met and read under his breath. He wrote lists of things he needed to fix, not in money, but in presence. He practiced patience and the small art of being late without making excuses. The city observed him like a specimen at a window and found him wanting and also disturbing. Amara let him into the edges of their life slowly. On the 5th day after the photo, she asked for one small mercy, that he accompany her to the school where the girls took a short creative class, a neutral place full of other parents. Dante came, flanked at a distance by Marco, but he stayed in the background. When Mira waved at him from a line of small dancers, he stood back, then walked slowly forward until he was 5 paces away, then 2. He kept his hands visible, empty, and the act was, for him, harder than violence. The girls accepted him in the fragile way of small beings who trust when adults invite them gently. Sage let Dante tie his sneakers and said nothing about the man's hands that had been used for harder business. Zuri took his finger and walked like a general testing a new command. As for Victoria, the rupture tasted like something she could not swallow easily. The Chen family read the absence as movement, a crack in Dante's edifice. Victoria called once. Her words were measured. Disappointment served cold. He did not answer. He let the silence be its own reply. For Dante, this omission cost him alliances and increased the noise in his life. But when he came home to the girls' folded drawings, he would let such costs gather dust in a lesser ledger. Marco's work chipped at the sediment of the photograph.
He found a pattern of messages routed through a burner line, a common method of anonymity, but he also found a ragged signature, a symbol, a small scrawled set of letters that matched a tag used by a known rival faction. Nothing in Marco's file suggested a full-scale operation, only that someone with motive and capability had noticed them and chosen to stir fear. There are people who would use what they know to press advantage, Marco said, but there are also people who would send a message to make you expose yourself. Then we do not expose ourselves, Dante answered. His voice had the tightness of a man with something to protect. Marco nodded. We watch. We don't fight publicly. We prepare. Amara agreed to keep the girls at the friend's apartment longer than first planned. She kept them away from their river bench and taught them instead a new skill: how to fold letters small and hide them in a shoe, how to read maps like they were stories. The girls liked the code play and giggled in the corners. It was, in its odd way, childhood. 2 days before Amara had scheduled a return to the river they had been careful around, Dante received another image. This time it was not a river photo. It was from farther away, an old apartment block with the laundry string waving in the wind.
It showed a window just wide enough to see a child's drawing taped to the glass and a small cloth flag someone had hung. Below the image was a new word: watch. The hair on Dante's arms rose. They are escalating, Marco said when Dante compared notes. They want you to know they can get closer. He was right. The messages had moved from discovery to proximity. That movement meant the sender had time and attention. It meant a pensive hand at a keyboard or a long-night observer outside a window. Dante understood that responding with the old currency, violence, but especially public strikes, would hand his enemies exactly what they wanted: spectacle and reaction. He also knew that not responding could put the girls at risk. The balance was brutal and personal in a way no negotiation had ever been. Every path cost something that could not be bought back with money. Amara met him at the edge of the decision with the same steady gravity she had always held. You can shelter them with money or with walls, she said, but their real safety depends on our ability to keep the small things constant. The school, bedtime, the dentist appointment, things you cannot buy or conquer. If you want to help, do those things. Be present in the ways that matter to them. It felt like a map without exact coordinates. Dante accepted it. He learned to make breakfasts that were not late, to ask questions about Mira's day and not only listen for what he wanted. He fetched a scraped knee when it appeared and sat through a puppet show with an attention that felt like penance. Each act was a dropping of a stone into a well. The rings would spread. And yet the world outside continued to make small, mean demands. A newspaper suggested his name in a rumor column, despite his best efforts. A man he once trusted called to warn of growing curiosity around his choices. Not every problem could be muted. For every step he took away from the old life, something in its shadow had momentum. Then, on a rain-skinned evening when the sky had dissolved into a soft gray, a package arrived at the friend's apartment. It was plain, wrapped in brown paper with no return address. The girls were in bed. Amara opened it with hands that did not tremble but were alert. Inside was a single child's photograph: Mira holding a ribbon, Sage with his jacket half on, Zuri with a smear of jam on her cheek. The frame suggested the picture had been taken on a different day, in a different apartment, one that was not theirs. Under the image, in black type, a single line read, "We can do this anywhere." The message was not a threat in the way the movies taught threats. It was a demonstration of mobility and an assertion that the sender could insert themselves into any space. The aim was to remove sanctuary. Amara's hand clenched the paper until it creased. She stood up and walked to Dante. "You wanted to show me you could be constant," she said. "This doesn't mean you are weak for wanting to protect them."
It means the other side will not let this go. Dante took the paper with fingers that had not known how to be slow before. He read the line and saw the geometry of the message, not just that they had been watched, but that no place was off limits. He felt the old instinct rise, to remove the threat with absolute, decisive force. But he also remembered the faces of the children, and the list Amara had made of conditions for his help. He could have bulldozed safety down into silence, but silence would have required him to bring in the kind of men and methods Amara had warned against. He chose a different violence, the violence of refusing to give them the reaction. He would not meet their provocation with an equivalent one. Instead, he rerouted resources,
legal counsel, financial arrangements, and the small human logistics that made a life plausible. He made arrangements for the girls to attend a different school under a private name. He hired a pediatrician in a clinic with no social media feed. He provided funds in a way that would not place the girls into the registry of his assets. The acts were mundane and slow, and extraordinarily hard. And while he did that, he also trained himself to be a guardian in the smaller ways: diaper changing, bandaging an imaginary wound, reading the same book until a child demanded it by title. These costs had no ledger other than the silent accumulation of trust. The sender of the messages did not relent. One afternoon, Dante received a video clip, a short, steady shot of the doorway to the friend's apartment, a door he had seen but never thought to watch. The footage stopped, then resumed, showing only the street. It ended with the same word as before: found. The clip's angle had the casual patience of someone who had the leisure to return and film for pleasure. Something about the way the clip was made nagged at Dante. It was not the hand of a professional. It had the ignorant cruelty of a man who wanted to puncture the day with a prick of fear. It was, Dante recognized with a tightness at his gut, the kind of message sent by a person trying to be noticed rather than by someone who had the refinement of a calculated threat. "Maybe it's a new faction," Marco said, leaning back in a chair as if to take the weight of it. "Maybe someone wants to dislodge you. But this is a different sort of signature. It's juvenile in method, but stealthy in persistence. Whoever does this has an agenda beyond money. Maybe mud, maybe revenge." Dante pressed his thumb to the corner of the photograph until the varnish warmed. He thought of the man he had been. Quick decisions, fewer illusions, a life measured in outcomes, not small kindnesses. This new work taxed him differently. It demanded that he choose the hard path of smallness. On a wet evening, in the small room where Mira had left a drawing of the river, Dante sat with Amara and spoke in a voice that had the honesty of confession.
"I will not let them take your life or theirs," he said. "But I will not give you a fortress. I will be solid. I will be present. I will be constant. I will choose them over anything else." She watched him. There was a long moment in which the two of them held the shape of the pledge between them, neither softening nor hardening. "Then prove it," she said. "Not with words. Prove it by accepting that this will cost you. You won't get to be the man who simply pays a debt and walks away. You will be present when the hard things are done. You will be the one picking them up when the school calls. You will miss dinners. You will take the calls at night about coughs. Prove it by the small exhaustion of being needed." He promised in the way a man could promise when he had nothing else in his pocket but time. He promised to pick them up from school on Thursdays. He promised to read with them every night on alternating weeks. He promised to be there for the dentist appointment and the small recital. He did not yet promise victory over the people who were watching, because he could not make a promise that stretched into other men's hands. Days folded into a rhythm that, in its own way, felt like peace. The girls returned to a version of normal that was both fragile and vehemently ordinary. They made art projects and asked Dante for the 30th time how the moon worked. He learned to braid hair with a clumsy patience that made them laugh. He learned the cadence of Mira's complaints and Sage's secret jokes. The work was not heroic. It was small and relentless. Then came the late-night call that shifted everything toward a new precipice. Marco's voice was terse. He had traced a message through a line and found a name that meant trouble. He would not say it on the phone. Marco's code was silence and the promise of an in-person briefing. Dante drove in the small hours to the cafe where Marco liked to hold counsel. The rain had polished the roads into glass and the city's lights smeared like watercolor. Marco slid into the corner booth and laid down a photograph. The photo was taken in dim light, handheld. It showed a woman, older, defined features, someone who could be anyone, standing in a doorway with a phone to her ear. On the doorframe behind her, someone had scrawled a symbol Dante recognized, a glyph that echoed a past he had tried to corral into retirement. The same symbol had been spotted in a market in the city months ago on a sticker, strange and purposeless. Marco's voice was a blade in the hush. "She is not in your organization. She works for the messenger. She has followers. She is a catalyst." Dante felt the old world gather like storm clouds. Catalysts did not operate without a cause. They may have names, wounds done in other lives, even whispered debts, and yet the fact remained that someone had chosen to turn his children into markers in a public letter.
When he left the cafe, a memory came back. A night 6 years ago. A quarrel over futures. An argument in which he chose a ledger over a small, warm body that would have used up his untidy heart.
He thought of the price paid, the children raised in a different city, the names he had not known until Marco's dossier. He thought of Mira's solemn face and Zuri's small laugh, and the cost of not being there. He drove faster than he should have, into the city that would notice but not understand. There were people he could call, men who would bring force, and yet he had promised Amara he would not. He felt the edges of the vow like a wire across his chest, sharp and demanding. To break it would be to return to an old architecture that used men as tools. To keep it would be to risk the lives Amara had trusted him with. There were no easy answers. He went to the river and sat where he always did, but this time he let the small wind find his face, and he thought like someone who had been given a last assignment, to be a father and not a king. That night, as he sat with the girl's latest drawings tucked into his inside pocket, his phone buzzed one more time. This message came with no picture. It came with coordinates and a single phrase: "We know where you sleep." Dante's body reacted in a way that years of training could not smooth. The words did not say they would harm the children. They did not promise an event. They offered instead a certainty. The reach had expanded. They could enter his private air. He put the phone down then. For a heartbeat, he felt the old temptation to call in work that solved problems in a way that left clean floors and fewer questions. But when he looked at the drawing in his hand, Mira's clumsy moon with glitter glued sparsely, a different knowledge anchored him. Violence would not necessarily stop watching. It might escalate it. The only thing that could cut the thread of surveillance cleanly would be a different kind of bravery. The bravery to choose smallness, even when the world demanded show. He rose, gathered the children's towels and their drawings, and walked into the night with both of the promises he had made. One promise was to Amara, to be present, small and inconsumable. The other was to the girls, to keep them the kind of ordinary children who liked jam on toast and made forts of living room blankets. Behind him, rain slid down the window like a film, and in the dark of the city, someone listened for the sound of paper and the whisper of a child's breath. The photograph had said found. The next message had said, "We know where you sleep," was low but steady. "They found a way closer," Dante said. "We expected that," Marco replied. "We can fortify, but fortify is a word that invites escalation." "I don't want escalation," Dante said.
"I need options that don't bring guns." Marco's silence was a practical thing. "We'll set things in motion that keep them out of sight without making headlines," he said. "We won't do violence, we will do everything else." The words were both comforting and dangerous. Dante acknowledged them like a man who crossed a canyon on a thin rope. Trust, but watch the rope. He returned to the temporary apartment and went inside with a new arrangement. He would be an unremarkable man in the days, and then in the small nights, he would do the strange calculus of finding threats without becoming them. He would do the tasks Amara needed him to do. He would be late for dinners and early for school pickups. He would choose presence. When he tucked Mira in that night, the child reached up and patted his cheek with a practiced, adult-like tenderness. "Stay," she said, the single word of all the contracts in the world. He stayed. He sat with their small bodies breathing together, a small, armored man in the quiet of a room that smelled of lemon and crayons, and on the table outside, his phone hummed with a city's indifference. The final message, when it came, was not an instruction but a proof. Not a photograph now, but a single frame of a social media feed, something small and public, where a face he recognized blurred across a video of the river. It was a woman mid-speech, a voice like a threadbare song, and the caption read, "Found what we were looking for." The clip had comments, glances of reaction, and the faint stench of something that wanted attention more than it wanted consequence. Dante looked at the screen and felt the twin currents of old power and new tenderness cross. He could answer with force and make a message of anxiety into a message of his own, or he could take the longer path through the daily labor of parenting and presence, the path that might not stop the watchers, but might change the stakes in a way his enemies had not anticipated. A man who became a father in the small ways and refused to commodify his children into leverage. He imagined the future as a long corridor of choices, the children learning to tie their shoes, getting into fights that would require apologies they would learn to make, winter mornings of soup and laughter. He imagined those small things threatened by a name on a screen and knew he had to choose. He went to the window, the rain sliding in streaks of silver, and watched the city breathe. He put the phone away, then picked it up again and texted Amara one line, "I'm here." Then he put it down. Outside, someone else watched a feed and smiled at a small demonstration of a power that could hurt.
Inside, a man who had built an empire out of fear bent his head over a child's drawing and made a plan that was not about obliteration but about endurance. The photograph had found them. The message had reached across the city and touched their small domestic life.
But Dante folded the fear into a different kind of answer. Daily, expensive, and unglamorous presence paired with the hard refusal to make the girls instruments of his war. He would not promise that the Watchers would vanish. He could not promise a future free of threats. What he could promise, the only real, honest thing, was himself. He sat down, drew the curtain, and held the drawing in his hand like a relic. In the low light, Mira turned her head and mouthed, "Daddy?" Dante leaned in and kissed her forehead, tasting chalk dust and the salt of tears he had not let himself shed in 6 years. He whispered, not a vow to the world, but a promise to the small creature under his hand. "I am here," he said. "I will not let them take this from you." Outside, the city moved on, and 100 small eyes looked for the way power would answer. Inside the apartment, a father and his 3 daughters gathered themselves into a circle of blankets and stories, and the next chapter waited like a held breath. If you want to see how far a man will go to protect what he finally chose, subscribe and leave a comment. Who do you think will try to claim them next?